I'm glad that you all decided to come out. I think what I'll try to do is speak for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then if you have questions, maybe we can use the rest of the conversation as a back and forth around these questions and themes as it pertains to Black History Month and to the topic at hand. I chose the topic, EnGendering Black Freedom, Organizing Chaos, and Drafting Colin Kaepernick, with the intention of trying to sort of include some of the important elements that speak to the current moment in politics and how they reflect back to the Bay Area, both contemporarily and in its history of activism and progressive politics. And so I think it's important to recognize that since the 80s, I kind of was looking back at the 60s as a student of Black politics, hoping and imagining that one day a movement will come along. I just kept thinking, a Black movement is coming sooner or later. I've been saying it for like 15 years, and I just kept thinking, a Black movement is coming. I went to the Million Man March. I thought the Million Man March was that moment in the 90s. I was in LA in the 90s, and I thought that would be the moment. And hip-hop came, and hip-hop called itself the movement, and hip-hop came, and Nas pronounced his death. Now we see sort of this new emergent movement that people have recognized as a movement for Black Lives Matter in general. I like to think of Black Lives Matter and any movement on behalf of African American people as part of a larger trajectory of the Black historical experience in America that people generally call the Black freedom struggle. And so for me, the Black freedom struggle is the big idea. And anything any individual or movement or moment does in the process of it, it should be recognized just as such. So for me, Martin Luther King is not more important than the Black movement. And I think in many cases, the media and white liberals have made Martin Luther King more important than any other aspect of Black history, to the point where we celebrate Martin Luther King for a movement of 500,000 Black people that began when he was a little boy. And he gets celebrated and worshiped and adored annually by the media and the law establishment that killed him. We act like Martin Luther King retired. Like he just chilled out, and all of a sudden Martin Luther King is everybody's favorite Negro. Now all of a sudden they're doing it to Malcolm X too. If you notice, Malcolm is also being celebrated. When did that start? Nobody ever loved Malcolm, and Martin and Malcolm both at the end, both were men that were no longer supported by the people who had claimed to support them. So Black Lives Matter to me is a movement that was predictable and inevitable and coming, largely because of the circumstances and the conditions that produced any struggle for African American people historically remain present today, even if they are in different form and in different style. And so for me, the idea that three young women or two young women had the idea to engage in what I call effectively a computer revolution, to come up with what us old folk call a pound sign and put it to some words, Black Lives Matter. And of course, the young folk call it the hashtag, and that somehow transformed this moment. But I really would like for people to take a step back before we start talking about Alicia Garza and Patrice Cullors and April Tomato and these young sisters and brothers who have become the front line of this movement, and really understand the backdrop to the movement, particularly as it plays out here in the Bay Area. You have to ask yourself, how does Colin Kaepernick, how does the Black Lives Matter movement find its traction here in the West Coast? How is it that Oakland moved New York City off the front page during the Occupy movement? How is it that Oakland becomes a focal point of the world in Occupy when Occupy started in New York and at Zuccotti Park, but it ends on Broadway and 14th? You can't get to the Black Lives Matter hashtag until you deal with Broadway and 14th. And that's the local aspect of this movement that the rest of this world and the rest of this country cannot appreciate, the local nature of this movement how it started very locally. And I argue, and I've been arguing, this entire phase that we're experiencing now is 10 years old, beginning with Gina, Louisiana. Everyone's forgotten Gina, Louisiana with the noose. And that's when Obama was running for president and wouldn't say anything about it. And that's pretty much the launching of the modern black movement, was around these young people at a high school. Young black kids who decided they got tired of white kids claiming the tree that they were sitting at for years, and the black kids said, "We sitting here this time," and it started effectively a reaction that produced a noose, that produced 3,000 people, young people using MySpace, when MySpace was Twitter or FaceTime. It used to be MySpace. MySpace was mobilized thousands of people around the country. Young folk did that. Young people saw what happened in Jenna. Young people mobilized on MySpace. 30,000 black folk and their allies converged on Jenna, Louisiana with 3,000 people. What people have missed is the way in which the Oscar Grant moment and movement largely explains so much that happened in all of this Black Lives Matter thrust. The Oscar Grant movement, I think, is important to hold up locally because it happened on December 31st, 2008, a month after everyone in the world was celebrating the arrival of the first black president of America. And Oakland said, "Nah, we're not feeling this. We're happy the man is elected." We celebrated too, but Oakland never stopped protesting. When the rest of the country was celebrating the post-racial breakthrough, Oakland was saying, "Nah, this ain't no breakthrough." Oakland kept protesting. Oakland kept in arrest. Oakland kept active. In fact, before Barack Obama was inaugurated, in that time period, in the 60 days between Obama's election and Obama's actual being put in office, his inauguration, Oakland that entire time was not buying into, at least as indicated by the unrest, into this idea that we've reached some sort of breakthrough. Oakland kept saying, "Nah, this is not a breakthrough." It's important. It's a very important moment. It's an important breakthrough. Let me correct myself. It is an important breakthrough, but to what extent does it break down the kinds of things that people see as the problems? So for me, the real big moment in this whole movement goes back 10 years to Jenna, Louisiana. But more precisely, locally, it goes back to the Oscar Grant reaction and the Oscar Grant movement. And so for me, Oscar Grant's support, the organizers of the local Oscar Grant movement, actually account for what most of us have forgotten was a general strike that happened in Oakland. Do you all remember when people shut down the Oakland port? That was the Oscar Grant movement and its allied movements. Latinos were mobilizing against Wells Fargo because Wells Fargo was purchasing the holding tanks that were holding undocumented workers who were being held before they get deported back to their home countries. And Latino activists organized against Wells Fargo. And that was connected to the Oscar Grant movement. Then you had workers, the local workers from the local unions had their own concerns. In other words, the Oscar Grant movement at the local level brought together all of these disparate issues and interests that collaborated together to speak truth to their moment. And that, to me, is what people have missed, is the significance of the Oscar Grant movement in the West Coast of California, in the Bay Area. You can't get Alicia Garza and April Tomato and the other sister, or Colin Kaepernick, without understanding the Oscar Grant moment and how that movement itself, even if it wasn't able to garner mass reaction, it certainly was at the local level the seed for most of the activism that emerges in reaction to the killing of Oscar Grant by Johann Messerly and his conviction. And yet what I think people don't appreciate in this moment is the extent to which the modern black movement, Vincent Harding, anybody know Vincent Harding? Anybody ever read Vincent Harding's book? When I was in high school, a sister who was a Delta gave me a book, and that book changed my life. That book was called There Is a River, by a brother named Vincent Harding, who helped Martin Luther King write some of his most important speeches, including the Vietnam speech. Vincent Harding died a few years ago. But Vincent Harding, who was a pacifist and a Quaker, a Mennonite, actually wrote a book called There Is a River. And he likened the black struggle to a river as a metaphor. And he wanted to cover from the Atlantic slave trade all the way to the 1960s period. But time only allowed him to go from the Atlantic slave trade to the breakthrough of the 1860s through the Civil War, and then he stopped. But what he outlined for us was a powerful metaphor and a powerful way of understanding the black freedom struggle as bigger than anybody or any movement or any aspect of the movement itself. The river is bigger than any drop of water that belongs to it. And that's the point I want to make, is Black Lives Matter is just another drop. So was Martin Luther King. So was hip hop. So was jazz. So was blues. So was black religion. So was Malcolm X. So is Colin Kaepernick. All of these things are part of a larger phenomenon where black people have sought freedom, and every generation has redefined what freedom meant to them. Freedom to someone in the 1860s was different than freedom, had a different meaning of what freedom is to someone today, right? And even today, freedom today means something different than someone even 30 years ago in terms of what they thought freedom was for them based on the obstacles that they confronted. And so what's really important to recognize is Black Lives Matter has followed the pattern and the anatomy of most movements, that most movements begin with a catalytic event or a precipitory event or something that just blows it up. And movements are like lives that humans live. Movements have a beginning, they have a juvenile stage, they get to be fully mature, and then they go into an eventual decline. The movements are a lot like human beings in that way, that they have a life that begins and a definite ending. About 2017, excuse me, The Root and the LA Times both published articles saying what happened to the Black Lives Matter movement, what has happened to it. And many people expected Black Lives Matter to work some sort of magic, when in truth, a lot of what it has achieved has gone undetected. For example, and I don't think the movement takes enough credit for this, here in the state of California, Jerry Brown, as governor, responded to Black Lives Matter and to the verdict in Ferguson in 2014 by eliminating the ability of the California prison system to maintain 23-hour long, to eliminate solitary confinement to people who are incarcerated, right? California did this not in reaction to Black Lives Matter. Let me correct myself. They did this in reaction to 3 men at Pelican Bay who in 2011 and in 2014 engaged in hunger strikes. Jerry Brown, responding to the hunger strikes, they eliminated the ongoing practice of solitary confinement in the state of California unless you're violent in jail already. But in terms of Jerry Brown reacting to the Black Lives Matter movement, they actually eliminated the ability of local prosecutors to use grand juries in secret whenever a cop kills a citizen. That's here in the Bay Area, in the state of California. The police can no longer rely on the secrecy of grand juries to aid prosecutors in not prosecuting law enforcement officers if and when they kill people. That's a concession to Black Lives Matter that Black Lives Matter, I don't think, recognizes. And if it does, I haven't seen anywhere where it takes claim for having changed that fundamental policy. So I'm trying to point out to you a way in which there was a concrete policy impact here in the state of California from the Black Lives Matter movement, and that is that prosecutors can no longer hide behind grand juries. Then allow them to say, I had no responsibility in charging this officer one way or the other. It was the grand jury's decision, which often lets prosecutors get off the hook easy. And we saw that in Louisiana, where that was a Democrat that did this in Louisiana, the prosecutor there, in terms of the Mike Brown and Darren Wilson case. And so I think it's important for Black Lives Matter to claim its victories and to recognize what policy changes it has impacted as opposed to people continuing to criticize it for being incoherent or inchoate and not focused. I think Black Lives Matter is a wonderful response to a miserable development in our politics. In the Obama era, I think we have experienced a general political reaction, a general ideological and cultural reaction, and it's played out in our politics. And so you look at the ways in which the Black Lives Matter movement has emerged, and there are so many aspects to the Black Lives Matter movement that are hard to put your hands on. But one of the things I think is really powerful is that the Black Lives Matter is almost a multi-fronted movement. It has taken pride in having no specific leader and no charismatic personality, and I'm not sure that's a good thing. The way that Black Lives, in which the way the Occupy movement came and went and didn't have an articulate person, and now we're trying to figure out what's next for Occupy. At least when there's a recognized leadership, there is at least it's possible to focus the agenda of the entire movement, but the idea that a movement is leaderless, I heard D. Ray McCusson this morning call it a leader-full movement instead of a leader-less movement, because from his standpoint, there are many, many leaders everywhere as opposed to a few leaders in one place. And I think part of the misunderstanding of the 60s is that black folk were all behind Martin Luther King. I mean, Martin Luther King was not supported by the majority of black people anywhere. And wherever he went, he always had problems for black folk to accept him. He got stabbed in Harlem. He got chased out of Harlem. Malcolm told the people of Harlem to give King a Harlem welcome. And the woman who just died about a month and a half ago went up to Martin Luther King and stabbed him in the heart. And he talks about that when he talks about, if I had just sneezed, I would have died. On April 3rd, the night before he dies, he gives that famous speech, the mountaintop speech. So I think it's important to recognize that the black movement was inevitable. It was going to come because the circumstances had not fundamentally changed. But the Black Lives Matter movement, in its own way, has approached both of the black community and challenged it on a number of fronts, as much as it's trying to challenge the larger social issue of police brutality and law enforcement reform. And that is the extent to which, and that's why this title of the work is Black Lives Matter, EnGendering Black Freedom. It suggests that there is a gender and sexuality dimension to Black Lives Matter that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. That Black Lives Matter is as much about the old pattern of black male heterosexual patriarchal leadership in the black church or in the Muslim movement in the Nation of Islam, and how they have had the prerogative, how heterosexual men have had the prerogative in black leadership going all the way back to Frederick Douglass. And how even though the first Moses ever, outside of the biblical Moses in America was a black woman named Harriet Tubman, the first black leader, and this is what I think needs to be checked, this idea that we got to undo black male leadership. The truth is, the first black leader of all was Harriet Tubman. Frederick Douglass comes along after. And all of them admire Harriet Tubman for the great woman that she was and her commitments to abolition. But it's important to recognize that there is an aspect of Black Lives Matter that deals with the old pattern of black male leadership in the religious organizations. And part of Black Lives Matter's subtlety is that it is challenging these prerogatives, the advantage that black leadership of the male orientation historically is now being questioned. And I think people don't realize that while people are marching Black Lives Matter, the black church is being pushed on the issue of sexuality. And very few people realize this. Black Lives Matter, at least 2 years ago, enjoyed 70% of the black community's support. While a recent poll came out and showed that the majority of this country does not support Black Lives Matter, the majority of black people do. And this is an important, I think, development to the extent that I think Black Lives Matter has to try to avoid the mistakes of the Black Panther Party. What the Black Panther Party did was it started feeling itself, even though the black church was the place where it was allowed to meet in West Oakland, the Black Panther Party started feeling itself. It started reading Marx. It started reading Fanon. It started reading these Marxists and others who were atheistic. And then they thought it would be useful to come back to the community talking about dialectical materialism. And the lumpen proletariat and the proletariat not recognizing that a black grandmother in West Oakland was not interested in dialectical materialism. She was interested in getting her children fed and safe and clothed and housed. And the Black Panther Party got caught up ideologically in thinking it was bigger than the black community. It started feeling itself, and it went around the country, black power, revolution, all this talk, and they forgot where they came from. Got so caught up in being recognized as celebrities. And it was the white folk that were admiring them the most. The New Left held up Eldridge Cleaver, held up Huey Newton, held up Bobby Seale, and the other, Stokely Carmichael and the others. And they failed to recognize that there was a need at the ground level to stay in touch with the community. And when it lost touch with the community, Huey Newton said this, and you can find this in his works on To Die for the People and Revolutionary Suicide. He talks about this problem of defecting, that's his word, how the Black Panther Party defected the black community. And Huey Newton said, because, and again, that was ideological. The black church, the black community was still deeply religious with the black church, and the Panthers were talking black revolution and atheism and agnosticism and Marxism, losing touch with the very community that wasn't there. And so Huey and the Panthers realized there was a great disconnect between them and the community they claimed to represent. And it was only after, listen to this, the Panthers had to fix this thing that they broke. They broke the relationship with the black community. And what did they do to fix it? That's when, listen to this, that's when they start the survival programs. That's when they start feeding the people. That's when they start doing the sickle cell testing. That's when they start the freedom schools after they messed up and lost touch with the community for becoming more important to it because they had a white audience and a national media audience, and the black community said, oh, the hell with y'all. We don't know y'all no more. Y'all don't know us. We don't know you. And I'm afraid if Black Lives Matter is not careful, it will be in the same predicament of getting caught up in all of this fanfare and attention being drawn over the past 4 years that it forgets that it was the community that it claimed to stand up and represent in the first place. And so I say that to say this. The breakfast programs were an attempt for the Panthers to fix what they messed up, trying to get ahead of the community. And most people don't recognize that when they talk about all the programs the Panthers did, the survival programs were the result of the Panthers being alienated from the black community. They had messed up and the community wasn't feeling them anymore, so they came back to the community with these food programs, with the health programs. And I'm saying to you that Black Lives Matter should learn the lessons of the Panthers, try to figure out how they can remain relevant if they lose the headlines. That should be a good development. Get out the headlines. That's the problem with the black movement historically, is it gets too many headlines. We don't need headlines. We need heads on the ground trying to change the local situation at the local level. We don't need celebrities and stars. We don't need D-Ray McKesson's vest becoming a symbol of black militancy. Are you kidding me? Do y'all know what I'm talking about? A blue vest is a symbol of black liberation. I mean, come on. So for me, it's important to recognize that Black Lives Matter is confronting the black community itself in terms of the black church's conservatism around sexuality. Black Lives Matter is doing that. Black Lives Matter does not hold up Martin Luther King. And I think this is really powerful and subtle. Black Lives Matter does not hold up Malcolm X. And the last two major phases of the black movement, Black Power and hip hop, valorized Malcolm X. And that to me is the important, that's when I knew Black Lives Matter was onto something different in terms of the traditions of black protest, is I can look back 50 years and see Malcolm X held up by 2 generations of people after him saying, this is what we think about this society. Malcolm represents it. That's what the argument of my book is. black nationalism in the United States from Malcolm X to Barack Obama is how the hip-hop generation held up Malcolm X to speak truth to the Ronald Reagan Revolution. Malcolm was our choice to say, here's how we feel about you, America. After Ronald Reagan, it's Malcolm, not Jesse, not Al, not Martin Luther King, Malcolm. Middle finger to you, America. Middle finger to you, Ronald Reagan. Malcolm X was the middle finger that hip-hop gave to America. And it was only after this that we begin to see this connection around the LA riots in '92, around the OJ divisions, the OJ case, and those disruptions. That had a lot to do with the general attempt of a generation, the hip hop generation, to speak to their moment. And now we have Black Lives Matter, and I think it has to be careful not to reproduce these same mistakes and these same errors, and to recognize that they are now the avant-garde of a generation of young people who have responded necessarily to these times. I'm glad they have responded. I was begging somebody to do something before I left this earth, because for a lot of people, this begins with Freddie Gray or Oscar Grant or, let's say, Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin. But for me, it goes back to Sean Bell in New York, where I'm from. If you can't tell, I'm a New York guy. If you can't tell, I'm telling you I'm from New York. Sean Bell, a young brother who was about to get married the next day, out at his honeymoon celebration, out at his celebration with his wife's fiance's family members, going out, young men having fun. They're walking out, the police hear his gun and shoot him 41 times. And they find no weapon, and nothing happened. I was in New York with Louima and Amadou Diallo, Michael Griffin going back to Howard Beach, going back to the 90s, the 80s. I'm talking about when crack hit. I'm talking about Do the Right Thing, the movie. All of that represented that time and those issues in that time. And what we have today are very similar kinds of issues, a similar kind of moment. And what we see, and I think Harold Cruz and Bayard Rustin predicted that the black movement would have a powerful connection to the issue of sexuality and gender breakthrough. They both, Cruz and Rustin was gay, acknowledged that this was the new frontier for the black movement. We have seen Eric Garner die in July of 14, Alton Sterling die in July of 16, Sandra Bland die in July of 15, Freddie Gray die in July of 15, Philando Castile die in July of 16, and Walter Scott die in April of 16. We've seen this parade of black young people, men and women, and some people not so young, on and on, before our televisions, on our computers, on our phones, and the inundation of being inundated with the images of black bodies being attacked by the law. And I wouldn't have a problem with America as a country if the country knew how to behave itself like a referee and not choose sides. But America has never been neutral in this thing. America has always been on one side. And the beauty of being black, and I'm thankful, I got into tears on the way over here thinking about this. And I was thinking I should be, because part of me is very critical of Black Lives Matter, but then I started thinking, I was looking and doing all this preparation, and I'm just looking at all the stuff that they were responding to, and I'm like, wait a minute, let me not be engaged in friendly fire, attacking them, when they got the FBI responding to them, even as white identity groups have taken over Charlottesville, Virginia, and have engaged in a massive reaction movement. The American government's response was not to go after the white identity extremists, but they come after black folk. After 9 days after Charlottesville, 9 days after the President of the United States basically suborned and aided and abetted the white supremacist element in this country, he then turns around and orders his Attorney General, who Coretta Scott King said was too racist 40 years ago to be a judge, to all of a sudden focus on black militant groups. And they've already prosecuted one brother down in Dallas. And he's believed to be a brother named Daniels. And he's believed to be the tipping point of this whole idea of identity extremism. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some police in here right now. I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't some FBI watching this event because it's a conversation about Black Lives Matter. That's what they're doing all over America. So if you're here in the tradition of Malcolm X, welcome enemies too. These young people have made the word woke mean something different. They've challenged a lot of our assumptions. They have decided not to be respectable and to engage in the politics of respectability. They asserted themselves in the 2016 presidential election effectively. And I think when I thought about on my way over here, the reason I welled up was I was thinking, I want them out there fighting. If this sister-led movement, that's what I'm trying to say if you can't hear me, this sister-led movement is, if this is it, then let it be it. If this is the movement, because I have 3 children, 12, 11, and 7, 2 boys and a girl who's 7. If this generation is a generation that can get the breakthrough, more power to them. And I support them. I want them to fight for my children. And that's what I got sad about. I was thinking, well, damn, I can sit here and criticize what is imperfect and not perfect about a movement and its ideas, or I can acknowledge the fact that they are at least rising up and confronting these things. And I pray that they keep confronting these things because if they don't, nobody will. It's not like the government was already addressing these problems of police reform in a way that people said, well, we don't need to march. The government's on top of that. People responded because they felt that there was no support. And so I want to wrap it up and just sort of suggest that it's important, I think, to recognize that you have had moments where Martin Luther King emerges on the scene at 26 years old. King is 26. When he first becomes well-known, Martin Luther King is 26. With Rosa Parks, he was 26. He died at 39. He never saw his 40th year. Malcolm was 27 when he got on the scene, when he got out of prison in 1952. Malcolm and Martin Luther King both were on the scene for 13 years. Both died in the 13th year of their programs. Malcolm was 4 years older than Martin. It's important, I think, to recognize that that even as Black Lives Matter had its moment and reached its peak, other movements, other efforts have been made by people all over this country, mostly young. People forget that the University of Missouri football players, when that football program rose up, it changed everything. Because that Black Lives Matter had largely waned and sort of teetered out. It didn't die, but it teetered out in terms of being the focus of whatever people were doing. And then the football players in Missouri, in St. Louis, where Mike Brown was killed, the football players said, we won't play. We'll bring this whole thing down. And imagine if all the black players in all the black sports just set up one day, we're not going to play. Do you think change would happen? I mean, I think we need to, I was looking at a comparison of Michael Jordan and LeBron James. And they were showing how LeBron had a whole lot of things that people don't know, actually doing better than Jordan in a lot of categories. And I kept looking at Michael and I kept looking at LeBron. And I said to myself, ooh, I love me some LeBron James. I love LeBron James because he has done what he did not have to do. As a young person, a millionaire, he's now 32 years old, he's already world famous. LeBron could do like a lot of other people and do nothing. But LeBron James, when Trayvon Martin was killed, LeBron James and D. Wade, knowing that boy was watching them at the All-Star game down there in Florida, where they were on the team in Miami before he died, it struck them, and both men, D. Wade and LeBron, and then Chris Paul, took over the ESPYs. And they took this proud moment. And when you look at the pictures of Ali and Kareem and Jim Brown and Ernie Davis and all those athletes supporting Muhammad Ali, I'm trying to suggest to you that we've had some great moments in this last 8 to 10 years that we should take a step back and appreciate, even amidst all the negativity. We have not had an athlete stand up to speak truth to power like this as LeBron has since Arthur Ashe. And before Arthur Ashe was Muhammad Ali. That is a major, I think, development that you have rappers like Killer Mike and David Banner. You know, they're OGs now, but they're trying their best to speak about these things. And I think this is what's important, is to recognize that, as Fred Douglass said, agitation, agitation, agitation. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never has, and it never will. So when Kaepernick gets involved and decides that he has seen enough, you got to recognize this, that Kaepernick was watching what you were watching. He finally rises up in 2016. Trayvon was killed 4 years earlier. Sandra Bland happened. Michael Brown happened. Freddie Gray happened. Walter Scott happened. He's watching all of these people again and again get shot, and almost in every case, the people were not criminally involved. And that's the difference. It's one thing if you got a gun at the police and the police take you out. You lost. It's another thing if you jaywalking and you get shot, and then Bill O'Reilly gets on national television and calls you a thug. So for me, Black Lives Matter is just the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of the black reaction. And I think we need to recognize that Black Lives Matter is a necessary movement, and the movement for Black lives is a necessary movement to bring about an awakening to all Americans, and now the whole world is talking about Black Lives Matter. And the whole world is talking about, in fact, I went out to Australia and gave a keynote speech to a bunch of Australians, and when I got finished speaking, I felt like, damn, I'm the only one in the room that knew what I was talking about. I was telling them about what was going on in America, and it was a talk about the Black Panthers. And I was talking, and I was like, well, they can't, I know they got their own history with the Aborigine being genocided, so they know, but I felt like the audience didn't understand what I was talking about. And then when I went home, like, that was about 4 years ago, and I've been wanting to call those people every day for the past 4 years and say, y'all know I was right, right? I just want to keep telling them, look, did you see what I was talking about? I taught in Spain for a summer, and I was talking to the other professors in Spain about the nature of race in America, and they didn't get it. And now I can't reach those dudes, but I emailed one. I said, hey, I told you this is what I was talking about. This is what we were talking about. America has a serious problem with race. Class 2. But race is what Bill Clinton called America's constant curse. Race is the one thing that everybody wants to be in denial. It's the only thing in your life that people, by definition, say that there's no such thing. And yet, the whole social order, the economic order, the way our police, the way law enforcement exists existentially in America is bound by the fact that you got Africa cut and pasted and put into America. You got Europe cut and pasted and put into America. You got the indigenous people erased almost to their reservations, the reses. And now you're told to make, and then you got Latinos and Asians of every different group. And now we're told to make this thing work. And the problem with that is we never dealt sincerely with the original racism that arranged the society as one with black and white. And that's the problem. We got Africa over here and Europe over here, and we're all supposed to get together when there's no other white population on the planet that lives with 40 million black people. You see it in Brazil. You see it in South Africa. You see it in Australia. You see it in New Zealand with the Maori. And in all 4 of those countries I just named, race is the most powerful explanatory variable explaining social relations in the society. In Canada, in Quebec, it's language. In Ireland, Northern Ireland, it's religion. In Yugoslavia, old Yugoslavia, it was ethnicity. In Bosnia, it was ethnicity. It just so happens to be race here. And Americans have never come up with a prescription to fix this fundamental problem of having Africa and Europe live next to get together. And that's the bottom line of race in America. Africa and Europe are living together. And nobody talks about that fundamental problem of the European being surrounded by brown people and what that means to them. That's something I think, if you look at world history, show me another white population that's had tens of millions of black people around them. And they just sort of were cool with it. It's unprecedented. The American experiment is unprecedented, what we're trying in this country to make it work. And the problem is not that we're together. The problem is we have not figured out how to be together and allow everybody to be free. White folk know what it's like to be free, to walk down the street and just walk, to walk in the store and don't think anybody's watching you, to never think about one day my son might get shot, to wonder, is the teacher being extra disciplinary on my child who otherwise is a perfect kid? The power of race in America has never, I think, been fully appreciated in terms of remedies, in terms of fixing the problem. And most people are just willing to sort of allow the issue to be resolved down the line by other people. So we end up with abolition. And we have the Civil War. And after the Civil War, we have 12 years of what Du Bois calls racial democracy. And Du Bois says if we had allowed that moment, right after the Civil War, to just continue on for about another 40 to 50 years, we'd be a lot further as a people, black and white, on the issue of race. If we just allow Reconstruction to be 50 to 60 years instead of 12. That was the moment right there. And when that wasn't fixed, the reaction was Jim Crow segregation. And so people like my mother, who just passed recently, born in 1925, they lived their whole lives underdeveloped by racism. And that's the problem. Hear me, please. Racism in America is a problem of black underdevelopment. Integration is an issue of black underdevelopment. Meaning, black people have not been fully allowed to be fully free in terms of their full potential to contribute to the political, social, and other orders of this country. And when you see one get through, you see the transformation. I mean, look at golf, right? We had Jim Denton, Calvin Pete, and a bunch of other folk, and then as soon as the doors were open, Tiger Woods comes through and whoa! Of course, he forgot who he was, but that's a separate question. You know, you can look at someone like Colin Powell, you know, or even Barack Obama. You know, when these breakthroughs are allowed, when black folk come in the room, they tend to really impact the space where they're allowed to get into. And I think that's the potential that black America has to make to this country. I'm saying that America, as much as people say it's the greatest country in the world and it's been the greatest country in the world, I'm saying America has been playing for the past 400 years with one of its best arms tied behind its back. So there are people that are content. There are people that are content as long as okay, good. You know, there are people that are content as long as you know, this hand never comes out from behind. They'll fight they'll fight Russia, they'll fight the Germans, they'll fight the Koreans. We'll fight anybody with one hand behind our back because we don't want black people to get free. Apparently, because it would apparently have some sort of a psychological effect. And yet, here's what's happening right now. I'm trying to give you some appreciation for what's going on in our country. And the US Census projects by the year 2040, so that's 22 years from now. So when you all reach middle age, the black population in America is projected, and you can Google this right now, the US Census. The black population in America, there's no genocide. They're talking about genocide. They're killing us all. Hell no, the opposite is happening. They're dying out, and the black population is actually growing. I know that's not nice. You don't want to hear it, but it's true. The black population in the United States is expected to explode. By 2040, the population of black Americans is going from 45 right now to 65 million in 20 years. And then in 10 years, by the time you all hit your 50s, they say the black population in America is going to be 75 million. The white population in America is going to peak in about 11 years from now. They will be 199 million in 11 years from now. That will be their high point. And then they go down in a sharp decline over the next 50 years to the point where they become a minority right when black people reach 75 million. The Latino population already in America, in every county in America, including Vermont, Maine, North Dakota, South Dakota, the Latino birth rates are outproducing and outperforming white American birth rates. The Asian population, especially those from South Asia like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, is the fastest growing group in America. They're outproducing Latinos. They're going from 3% to 6%. So all your life, the number of Asians you've seen, double it. That's all happening in the next 40 to 50 years, according to the American government. And I think that has a lot to do with a lot of what we're dealing with. The reaction, the confusion, the violence, the racism, the marches, the protests, the monuments, the president, all of that is because this country doesn't know how to deal with this tremendous social transformation that is upon us, what scholars are calling the Browning of America. And so the truth is, I think in part, the white reaction to this phenomena has produced a black and brown reaction to the white reaction to this phenomenon. So Black Lives Matter is actually reacting to white folk, reacting to black folk. And the notion of existential threat, the real issue with the white population, and not even talk, and let's add the issue of opioid abuse, where we're seeing 50,000 people die a year, 45 to 54 years old, white folk who I grew up with, having a midlife crisis to the point where they're dying off. This is a tremendous moment of change for everybody is what I'm trying to say. And we need enlightened leadership, spiritual leadership, wise leadership to navigate this tremendous social change, to help us understand what it means as a society, black, brown, Native American, Asian groups, Asian populations. We need wise leadership to say, here's what this means. This is a beautiful opportunity for all of these reasons, right? In other words, we need someone to help us navigate this change in a positive direction. What we're getting is navigation in a very dark and dangerous direction. So Donald Trump is a response to all of this. You know, it would be nice if we had, you know, I don't know, somebody like Lyndon Johnson become president right now, you know, instead of Donald Trump. If we had an LBJ for the black community right now, it would be a great thing. But what we have is Donald Trump, and that's the reality. What I'm suggesting to you is that change is happening, and the change is demographic, and there's a lot of confusion about it. And instead of us being, as a country, offered wise spiritual direction around this change, we are being offered just the opposite. And it's playing out in our politics. And so the idea as a cop, you know, and I work with SFPD on 2 different committees as a result of Barack Obama's criticism and 272 findings of SFPD's issues. And so and my wife is in law enforcement. So I'm very sensitive to police and to law enforcement officers. I tried to become a cop out of college. I tried to become a Beverly Hills Cop because I watched a movie with Eddie Murphy. I figured, shit, he's from Long Island, I'm from Long Island. If he could become a cop, I could become a cop. So I tried to become LAPD and Beverly Hills, and they both rejected me, thankfully. But my point is, so I'm not, by definition, I don't automatically have an antipathy toward law enforcement. But what I do know is that what we are witnessing is not law enforcement. This ain't policing. This is some bullshit. This ain't policing. What you're seeing, where people are just shooting. There are cops that have been on the job 40 years, ain't never pulled their guns. We got dudes that were on the job for a week and they shooting. And everyone wants to forget. This is the deep thing about America. This is what I mean by the denial of racism. When the Obama administration came into play, it was, I think it wasn't Donna Shalala, but it was the head of the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you, thank you so much. Janet Napolitano gave us a warning in 08 and 09 that white extremists, white nationalists, and other groups have infiltrated law enforcement. That came from the government. And of course, the right conservatives on Fox and everywhere else said, oh, that's just hogwash. But the government warned us this was coming. But the politics behind it won't let us hear the message. The government said law enforcement has been infiltrated by white reaction. And Fox News says, don't listen to what they're saying. But we have seen, I drive around in my car with the picture of Philando Castile and Brother Sterling in my car, and a young white woman who was killed out in Antioch. I keep it in my car, a sign from one of the marches I joined. I've been a part of a whole bunch of these Black Lives Matter marches, and I had one, and I keep it there every day in my car. I let my sons and my daughter see, it just sits in my trunk, and I remind myself every day I open my trunk that this is the reality of where I live. That as I drive this vehicle, I could be pulled over and taken out at any second. This is not sustainable. It ain't sustainable for a country for people to be pulled over and end up dead. Philando Castile told the officer in the passenger seat, I have a weapon, I'm a concealed carrier in a concealed carry state, an open carry state. And the cop was talking shit, excuse my language, elders, before they killed him. If you remember, the cop, who was not white, sat there and told his co-officer, hey, they look like they're guilty. They look like they're up to no good. He just looks like a suspect. That's what he said. He looks like a suspect. He looks like somebody who we might be looking for. That's what they said right before they murdered him. So it goes into the racist mindset of the officer, and a reliable jury said not guilty. So my final comments are this. African Americans and their allies have got to seize this moment and demand real reform. We're not going to have revolution. We can talk revolution. Everybody can play with revolution and gesture towards revolution. Ain't no revolution happening in America. This country's too big, too spread, and its military is too powerful for anybody to be doing anything other than running their mouth. If somebody uses revolution around you, just leave them alone. I'm serious. I mean, here in the Bay Area, we had 50 years of people just running their mouths, talking. Revolution, black this, black that, revolution. We don't need talkers. We need a program. We need plans. We need young people to go back into the community and tutor. I'm sure out of you young people right here, some of y'all know math real well. And there are young kids sitting around needing your help. That's where you can get on the front line. You ain't got to get up and confront the police. You ain't going to win that battle. We're not going to win those kind of confrontations. But I think if we as people begin to focus on the community and engage in community development, that's what I want Black Lives Matter to do now, is turn its energy away from law enforcement and turn back into the black community and begin to develop programs in the community around youth development. That's what I want. If I could have a dream, it would be those sisters from Black Lives Matter and everybody who's marched and everybody who speaks up on behalf of Black lives and any other effort would go back and begin at the level of our young, begin educating them, tutoring them, helping them learn basic skills to articulate themselves and to be successful as people. That's what we have left. But trying to fight the police, you already see they've become a military. They're not the police no more. The police that anybody here is 45 years old or older, the police that you knew, that ain't the police no more. Excuse my English. That ain't the police. We're onto something advanced in terms of the militarization and their weaponry. Don't get me wrong. The same heart in law enforcement that shoots Michael Brown is the same heart of law enforcement that shot Brother Stokes from the Nation of Islam in LA back 50 years ago. So that hasn't changed, but the equipment and the technology has, and then the way in which each incident of violence seems to get baked in, and we just sort of look at it and we just sort of move on, and that becomes normal. So now when a cop shoots someone and gets off, we're all like, okay, well that's the way it is now. And I think we have got to push back and try to undermine it by challenging it. I'm doing the best I can. What I'm doing in my life is every time anybody gives me a chance to speak about these issues, like now, I do. I'll be on channel, I think, 4 later today. I'll do my best to stab, get a little stick in on the president. I got to try to pretend to be objective, but I be saying, this man is, I be like trying to get my little stabs in as best I can, trying to, I work with a program in San Francisco called San Francisco Achievers, which is a scholarship program for every black boy that graduates from San Francisco Unified School District with a minimum GPA of 2.5. We give them about $5,000 to $7,000, sometimes more, for 4 years of scholarship and mentoring. San Francisco Achievers is a program. I'm the board vice president. When I was a kid, I was from a family where my father had died when I was 5 years old. I was raised without a father in the projects in New York. And the Delta Sigma Theta sorority gave me a scholarship that changed my life. It was only $500, but it was the idea that somebody thought I was important. They gave me $500. Man, I got $500 in my shoe right now. Don't mean nothing to me no more. But that $500 when I was 16, 17 years old changed my life because it was saying, we believe in you. So I support this scholarship program over in San Francisco to tell young brothers who graduate, we believe in you, right? What are you doing? Where are you contributing? Where are you doing your work? If you're older and tired and retired, there's a lot you can still do in terms of teaching us, giving us the knowledge we need. Just have conversation, just talk to us. Just talk to the young. Tell them, even when they act like they don't want to hear it, they hear it, tell them anyway. Because one day they will come back to it. I think I've talked you out and I've talked myself out, so I'm gonna stop right here and I'll go ahead and take any questions or comments that you might have at this time. Thank you very much, all of you.